We can now bring in Ali Vaez, Director of the Iran Project and Senior Advisor at the International Crisis Group. Thank you so much for joining us on the program today. Now, Iran's Defense Ministry has put out this statement that the U.S. is no longer in a position to dictate policy to other nations. Does Tehran feel like it's backed the U.S. president far into a corner where he would lower his demands?
It's good to be with you. Yes, Iranians do believe that they have the upper hand because they can endure this double blockade better than the United States. Of course, there are political considerations for President Trump. He is supposed to meet with President Xi of China on May 14th. And if this crisis is not resolved by then, it would put President Trump in a weaker position before meeting his Chinese counterpart. And then in June, of course, we have the World Cup games in the United States. And if there is the jet fuel crisis continuing by that point, it can undermine the games. And finally, it's the more important political consideration that there are midterm elections in November. And if the strait opens up now, maybe the gas prices will come down before the elections. Otherwise, they will stay up until after the elections, and that would be a political disaster for the Republicans.
Ali, let's talk about this latest proposal, which apparently the US has gotten from Iran through Pakistan. Would Donald Trump agree to put the nuclear issue on the back burner for now, given that this was the reason Washington said it went to war with Iran? But on the other hand, the US president does need this off ramp.
I think the president will be torn because, as you said, he would like to see the strait opened again. And there are true pressures, political and economic pressures on him to do so as soon as possible. But he also probably now thinks that the reason Iran is offering such sequencing is because the blockade, the US blockade, is also hurting the Iranian economy as well.
Hmm.
And he might want to continue to see if he can get Iran to surrender to his terms. So he's torn in two directions. But at the end of the day, the biggest problem he has is that even if Iran opens the strait, it's still going to be conditional opening. It is still going to be under Iranian control,
Hmm.
and the Iranians still want to be able to charge a toll.
Over the past few days, we've seen Iran's foreign minister shuttle between Pakistan. He made two stops in Pakistan, Oman, and then Russia yesterday. Does Abbas Araghchi's meeting with Putin mean that really prove that Moscow helped Iran during the conflict with the United States? And also it begs the question what role Russia can play in the future, particularly when it comes to that highly enriched uranium Iran has.
Well, the visit clearly shows that Russia is can be both part of the problem and part of the solution, in the sense that it did provide Iran with significant intelligence and military support in form of electronic warfare or even man-pads to shoot down U.S. fighter jets or drones. But it can also be part of the solution because if there is to be any kind of framework or new arrangement for the Strait of Hormuz, it might require some kind of international framework recognized by the UN Security Council, of which Russia is a permanent member. And also, in order to resolve the nuclear issue, one option is to ship the highly enriched uranium stockpile of Iran, as was the case about 10 years ago when we had another nuclear deal, to Russia.
Mm.
And so these conversations are important both if the war continues or if there is a deal to be implemented.
How much of a free hand does Abbas Araghchi actually have, given that I think it was 10 days ago where he took to X to announce that the Strait of Hormuz was opened, and then a day later, the IRGC effectively said it was shut. So, who is really calling the shots within the Islamic Republic?
Look, the IRGC reaction was to President Trump announcing that the blockade would continue. It was not to repudiate Foreign Minister Araghchi.
Mm.
In between the two events you mentioned, there was a Truth Social post by President Trump mentioning that even during the ceasefire, he wants to keep the U.S. blockade in place, which was a violation of ceasefire terms. But at the end of the day, Araghchi is an implementer. He's not really a decision maker. The decisions are made by the top brass of the Revolutionary Guards, who are now in key positions of power. And they provide him with a framework for negotiations, and he operates within that framework.
We know that the U.S. president says he's achieved regime change in Iran. This, even though the former supreme leader's son, is now the new Ayatollah. But amid reports that Mojtaba Khamenei is severely injured, and we've seen the IRGC take on this more dominant role, it seems that it's the generals and not the theocracy who holds more sway within the Islamic Republic.
Yes, in fact, President Trump has not changed the regime. He has transformed it by basically changing the balance of power within the regime. In the past, the Revolutionary Guards was subservient to the supreme leader. The new leader is no longer supreme because he's subservient to the Revolutionary Guards, to whom he owes his position and the survival of his system.
Hmm.
And even within the leadership of the Revolutionary Guards, you have now much more radical and hardline figures who are calling the shots than was the case in the past.
And what does it mean for ordinary Iranians living under this system now that you have the generals who have more control?
Well, it just means that a bad situation in Iran is going to get worse
Mm.
because Iranian people are very unhappy with their circumstances even before the war started. And they experienced, when they protested, they experienced a massacre by a regime that wasn't even as hardline as it is today. And so they would have to live with a wounded, probably much more repressive regime who can't even meet their basic economic needs.
And given that the IRGC is slightly more pragmatic, and I heard that they would even entertain possible US investments in Iran, would they be able to fix the country in terms of improving the economic situation?
Look, it takes two to tango,
Mm.
and the experience in the past this prelude basically demonstrate that it is very difficult for Iran and Trump to end up on the same page. Their styles are just not incompatible, are not compatible, and President Trump's desire to come out as a victor and humiliate the other side often makes it very difficult for the Iranians to end up in a mutually beneficial deal with him. So at least in the short run, the Iranians are insisting on collecting transit fee through Hormuz because they're actually very cynical about the prospect of getting sanctions relief. I do believe that they're wrong in that assessment, in the sense that President Trump can deliver the kind of sanctions relief that almost no other US president has been able to in the past 2 decades, or maybe in the future. But again, that cynicism does exist, and I do believe that it is becoming an obstacle to reaching an agreement.
Ali, final question. We know that Israel, I've spoken to former US officials, and they have told me that Israel wants to keep the war going. So, given that Iran knows this, even if the Islamic Republic reaches a deal with the United States, you think they'll always be looking over their back to see when Israel attacks again?
Well, look, this is one of the reasons that Iranians insisted, as part of the ceasefire terms, that it would extend to Lebanon, because they wanted to see if President Trump is able to contain Israel.
Mm.
And there is also one reality that is undeniable. There is, unlike in Lebanon or in Syria or in Gaza, Israel can't really unilaterally decide to go to war with Iran. It always needs to inform the United States. It always needs to have the U.S. support, at least on the defensive side. And this is therefore not a decision that Israel would be able to do to make on its own.
Mm.
And the entire strategic logic of this war for the Iranians was to demonstrate to the United States, for the first time since President Trump killed General Soleimani in January 2020,
Mm.
that war with Iran, a confrontation with Iran, is going to be costly. And they are hoping that the U.S. has learned that lesson.
Ali, thank you very much for joining us today. Ali Vaez joining us there from Geneva.